Hi, I'm Dave Ganskopp of the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center with an Eastern Oregon Ag Minute. Over the last few summers, we have been using cattle equipped with GPS collars to help us learn about how landscape characteristics and management programs affect livestock distribution on rangeland. These GPS collars are wonderful instruments for these studies for several reasons. First, they're remarkably accurate, with the ability to estimate cattle locations within about 2 to 4 yards of the animal's true position. Second, the collars can be programmed to determine positions from 1 time per day up to 144 locations per day. Unlike people, they will work 24 hours a day, rain or shine, for weeks at a time. Lastly, the collars are also equipped with motion sensors that can tell us whether cattle were grazing, walking, or resting in particular portions of the pasture. In the coming days, we'll discuss some of our findings from these instruments and how they might apply to livestock management in our rangeland pastures. Today we're discussing some of our recent studies where we've used GPS collars to track cattle movements on rangelands. One fact that's clearly evident when we map cattle distribution in some of our larger pastures on the northern Great Basin experimental range is that over a month's time, cattle will only visit about 30 to 40% of a pasture. This means a lot of available forage goes unused, and we could support many more animals if we could get cattle to disperse and uniformly graze the landscape. Some locales are too steep or rugged for cattle to comfortably use, but there are still many accessible areas with perfectly good forage that cattle seem to ignore. One of the management objectives of our research is to lure cattle to those unused areas. Accessing that additional forage can let us keep a given number of cattle in a pasture for a longer period, or alternatively, let us carry more cattle and still furnish adequate quantities and qualities of forage. Today we're discussing some of our recent studies at the station where we use GPS collars to document cattle movements. Recently, we tracked cattle in 3 of our 2,000-acre pastures as we moved mineral supplements and water troughs to several locations. Textbooks have long taught that water and salt are powerful attractants for luring cattle to distant portions of pastures. We found that moving portable water tanks or turning water supplies on or off in specific locations of pastures were very effective for attracting cattle to unused areas. That practice effectively lured them away from habitually used locales, as cattle would totally pick up housekeeping. They did not just hike over for a drink and return to their old haunts. Moving stock salt to remote or seldom used areas was completely ineffective, even when cattle were herded over for an introductory look. For health and production reasons, however, we still feel stock must have access to mineral supplements. One should not expect its placement, however, to substantially change cattle distribution. We're discussing some of our recent studies at the station where we use GPS collars to track cattle distribution on rangelands. One nearly universal observation of livestock managers is that cattle tend to use the same portions of pastures from year to year. We speculated this was mostly due to a lack of old growth or cured herbage in historically grazed areas, and tested that hypothesis by fencing off portions of smaller pastures in one year and following cattle movements when they returned and had the whole pasture available next year. When cattle returned, they spent about 70% of their time foraging in areas used last year, even though those locales supported less than half as much grass. When grasses are green and growing, cattle clearly select forage quality over forage quantity. Fire is a potential tool for removing old standing herbage from rangelands at landscape scales. Today we're discussing some recent studies at the station where we use GPS collars to track cattle movements in large pastures. 2 years ago, we managed to burn an area in one of our pastures that cattle have historically ignored. Last spring, the cattle returned to the pasture and grazed almost exclusively in the burned area. This was a classic example of what managers should not do because the recovering vegetation bore the full grazing load for the entire pasture. In late summer, after all herbage had cured, we restocked the pasture and cattle no longer focused on the recently burned and recovering area. 2 lessons came out of this project. One, if we expect to apply some prescribed fires in a pasture, we should burn as much of the landscape as possible to avoid focusing animals on a limited area. Second, if we can hold off grazing a recently burned pasture until the grasses have cured, cattle will be less likely to focus on the treated areas. This would also give recovering herbage a full growing season to reestablish itself. I'm Dave Ganskopp. Let's all be careful out there, and we'll see you again.